So the highly anticipated sequel to the Gladiator film is finally here, and it has made its theatrical debut in theaters, and I just got out of theaters from witnessing this film on the big screen. So without further ado, let's discuss Gladiator 2. Let's get into the movie review. Let's go. Gladiator 2 is an action-adventure film directed by Ridley Scott and comes 23 years after the release of the original film in the year 2000. With the original Gladiator film being a classic, this sequel has a lot of pressure on it to succeed, or at least somewhat follow in the footsteps of the original movie. And with it now releasing in theaters, there's of course already plenty of reviews out, and I gotta say they've been pretty divisive so far. Gladiator 2 takes place about 15 years after the original film. Years after witnessing the death of Maximus at the hands of his uncle, Lucius must enter the Coliseum after the powerful emperors of Rome conquer his home. With rage in his heart and the future of the empire at stake, he looks to the past to find strength and honor needed to return the glory of Rome to its people. So as you can imagine, in Gladiator 2, we are following the character Lucius, who is the son of the great Maximus Commodus from the original Gladiator film. And with that being said, I have a lot of positives to say about this film with a few negatives. So without further ado, let's get into my positives for Gladiator 2. Starting with my first positive for this film, we're going to begin with Paul Mescal as Lucius, that being our gladiator for this movie, and as I already mentioned, the son of Maximus inside of this Gladiator universe. Now, we spend the majority of our time in this film with this character, and I think he does a fantastic job as the protagonist inside of this film. He is the spitting image of Maximus, of his father. He kind of embodies that warrior spirit. He's not, the war general like Maximus was, which gave him that extra boost and love from the crowd when he enters into the Coliseum in that first film. Whereas in this film, Lucius is more of a prisoner of war, if you will, who is then turned into a gladiator, which is the typical route that took us to getting gladiators for the Coliseum. Now, if you've seen the first film, you would know that this character is not someone who grew up in the comfort of having, a home with his mother and his father. This was someone who's been on the run pretty much since he was 12 years old, and because of that, it makes this character very compelling to the audience, not just the audience of the film, but the audience of the Coliseum, whereas we're not watching a character who already has all this glory to his name. Instead, this time around, it's someone who has to earn that glory through his performances as a warrior in the Coliseum, but also through the actions that he takes inside of this film. And overall, this is one of, I would say, 3 characters that really shine bright inside of this movie and made for a great protagonist and addition to this film. Overall, I thoroughly enjoyed the character of Lucius, played by Paul Mescal. Now, moving on to my second positive for this film, I would have to go with Denzel Washington. Now, to be honest, he was my favorite character inside this entire film. He stole the whole show. He stole the movie. As an audience member, he won me over just slowly but surely throughout this film. And inside of this film, Denzel is playing a character by the name of Maximus, who is this black, rich nobleman inside of Rome. He's in the emperor's circle, but he doesn't exactly hold any real power of his own outside of the fact that he's rich. Now, he begins as a bit of a side character inside of this film, and as it progresses on, his character arc that he goes on as he plays the Game of Thrones, as he plays the game of politics and tries to put himself into a position where he is now the emperor of Rome. It's amazing to get to see his character go through this progress throughout this film. Now, you do get a typical Denzel Washington performance in this character of Maximus, but it's always amazing to see him on the big screen, especially with his mannerisms, the way he moves, the way he thinks and just shifts his eyes across a room and looks at characters, and you can already tell, what's plotting inside of his head just through a glance or a look that he gives someone. And by the end of this film, he easily became my favorite character. Now let's move on to my next positive of this film and our final third character that I would say is a major highlight in this film, and that would be Pedro Pascal as the character Marcus Acacius, is I believe how you pronounce it, and he is the Roman war general inside of this movie. So essentially, he took Maximus Commodus's position from the first film, and he is now in that position himself. And I gotta say, he honestly comes across a little bit like a Maximus type, whereas yes, he's a war general, but throughout all of these different battles, it's made him humble as a person. He doesn't really seek glory. In fact, constantly throughout this film, he tries to turn it down a majority of the time, especially when offered that glory by the emperors inside of this movie. And he's just an extremely righteous character. He's someone you can't help but like after watching this film. And to be honest, Pedro Pascal is one of the best actors in Hollywood at the moment. So getting to see another performance out of him in a film this big was amazing to see. I'm glad to get to see him back on the big screen. And yeah, he did an amazing job inside of this movie. Now, moving on to my next positive for Gladiator 2, that would be two characters who are kind of fulfilling the role of one inside of this film, that being the twin emperors for this movie, which is actually a historical reference to two emperors who were ruling together in the real history for Rome. That being the twin emperors Caracalla and Geta are their names inside of this movie. And as you're introduced to these characters, you think they're on an even playing field. You think, because they're twins, that their mind functions exactly the same, but that's not really the case with these characters. While they're twins, and for the most part, they enjoy the same things such as bloodshed and watching gladiators perform in the Coliseum, and they kind of have the same ideology. One particular emperor you'll start to notice over the course of this film clearly has his hand on the helm of the throne a lot more than the other does, and his twin brother ends up having some sort of mental deficiency you'll begin to notice in his actions and the thing he says and the way he acts inside of this film. Honestly, it's a really solid performance out of these two actors that are playing the two emperors inside of this movie, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Now, are they as good as Joaquin Phoenix in the original Gladiator 2000 film? Definitely not, because that's Joaquin Phoenix. He's one of the greatest actors of all time, especially at this very moment. But I think these two did a very solid job to at least keep up with the importance of this role inside of this movie. Now, moving on to my next positive for Gladiator 2, that would have to be the score of this film. It feels so triumphant and larger than life when you watch this movie, especially if you're watching this in theaters, which I highly recommend you see this film in theaters. I think this is the best way to watch this movie easily. But when you're hearing this score and this soundtrack in theaters with the surround sound, and it's thumping and it's getting your blood boiling and getting you prepared and ready for these huge action set pieces that you get to see inside of this film, it's amazing. It really gave this film that extra big boost that it needed to feel larger than life, like it feels when you watch it, and I thoroughly appreciated that. So shout out to whoever produced and came up with the score of this film. Now, moving on to my next positive, I would have to go with the brutality and the gore that you get to see on display inside Gladiator 2 and inside of the Coliseum. I think they took it an extra step further than you got to witness in the original film, whereas I don't feel like the violence in that film was as on display as a movie title and a movie set like in the Coliseum would suggest that it would be, whereas in this film you definitely get that blood, that gore, that display of violence, absolutely, especially inside the Coliseum and even outside of the Coliseum in some of these scenes. Now, another positive for Gladiator 2 would be the storytelling, and more specifically, the way that they interweave the original first story into this movie, whereas at first going into this, I didn't really think it would have much to do with the original film, because that film is pretty conclusive. When you watch it, it has, a beginning, a middle, and an end to this character that you're watching the whole time, and it's pretty much over. But in this film, they did a fantastic job of bringing back story elements from this original film, especially with it taking place so many years after the release of the original film. We get to see some characters return from the original. Granted, they don't have a huge part inside of this movie. I've seen some complaints about that, but I don't think it's that much of a big deal, especially considering this film is not about them and what happened that many years ago. It's about what's happening now and how those before events inspired what's happening now. In Gladiator 2, I like that the first film does not overshadow this movie too much, and while it does follow a bit in the footsteps of the original movie, with the story elements being a little bit similar in terms of the path our characters take, I don't think it's as egregious as people are making it out to be in some of the negative reviews I'm seeing. You gotta remember that this is a sequel to the original, and that the character we're following is literally the son of the protagonist from the original. So of course it's going to take some of those story beats and some of those character elements from the original. It's inevitable, and I really do not have a complaint with that here. I think it was implemented very well and very respectful inside of this film. Now, with that being said, that makes up my positives for this film, for Gladiator 2. As you can hear, I have a ton of positives for this movie, but that's not to say I don't have any negatives whatsoever. So with that being said, let's now move into my negatives for Gladiator 2. Starting with my first negative for this film, it would have to be that there is bad CGI inside of this film at times, and it's not completely consistent throughout the entire film, but you'll especially notice it once they start incorporating and bringing animals into this movie, such as, sharks or primates. In one particular scene, the gladiators are actually fighting primates, and they just look terrible. I hated the design of these primates. I hated the way that the sharks move throughout the water. You can consider this a nitpick if you want, but if you're actually paying attention to this film, these things are pretty glaring in my personal opinion. And it even took me out of some of the awesome scenes that we got to see inside of this movie, such as like this naval fleet scene where Pedro Pascal's character, the war general, is, trying to conquer new land inside of this movie. And it just ripped me right out of such a amazing, action set piece for this movie. Now, that brings us to my final negative for Gladiator 2, and that would be that the ending of this film felt just a little bit rushed to me. Now, that's not to say that I didn't enjoy it whatsoever, because I definitely did, but when you're building up two characters to finally collide and go against each other, and especially one that's been in the background for a majority of the film until the very end of this movie, you expect him to not just get washed up in the final fight scene. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, they spend all this time in this movie making you care about this character, making you pay attention to this character, his motives, his moves, what he's doing, what he's plotting, what he's planning, and I'm not going to say exactly who because of spoiler reasons. But let's just say I was not satisfied with the conclusion of what ended up being a major character inside of this film. And with that being said, that would be my negatives wrapped up for this film. So let's move on to my overall review for Gladiator 2. Guys, Ridley Scott knocked it out of the park with this one. Did an amazing job with this film. I haven't felt this passionate about a movie that I've seen in theaters all year. Quite honestly, this film brought that out of me. It made me care about every single character, every single storyline, and even Rome as a whole, and what was going on with the city and the politics and everything just kind of weaving together to make what you get here inside of this film. On top of the fact that there's amazing fight choreography, amazing action set pieces, an amazing score, 3 great villains for this movie. The sheer spectacle of the Coliseum as a whole and how larger than life it really feels inside of this film. And the fact that this is a sequel that none of us expected to ever get. I mean, I thought it was pretty wrapped up with the first movie. It had a complete story in that film, as I previously mentioned. So to get to see Gladiator 2 back on the big screen, to get to see it under the same director, and then to go and see it in theaters and actually watch it play out, and I thoroughly enjoy my entire watch through it, I can't recommend you guys see this film in theaters any more than I'm doing so right now. So with that being said, let's go ahead and drop the official rating for Gladiator 2. I give this film a 9 out of 10. It gets the 9 out of 10. Quite honestly, I do not know why this film is so divisive right now, why there's so many, critics or movie reviewers kind of bashing, hating, having a lot of critiques over this movie that I don't think are fair, and I don't think that it fully deserves. I'm gonna definitely have to check out, what other people are saying in the community that I haven't had a chance to really look into yet, because quite honestly, I hate seeing other people's reviews before I give my own take and I record my own review, because I feel like sometimes it could skew what I'm going to say in my own review. But yeah, I just wanted to give, my honest opinion, my honest take on this movie after witnessing it in theaters on the big screen. I thoroughly enjoyed this film. I'm definitely going to go check it out probably at least one more time before it ends its theatrical run. And that being said, guys, I'm curious to know your thoughts on Gladiator 2. Have you seen this film? If you have, let me know your thoughts on this film down in the comment section down below. If you haven't watched this movie, tell us down below whether you will or won't be going to see this movie. And if you don't know what we do here on Demigod ENT, we do film and TV reactions and reviews and other movie-based content. So if you're interested in any of this movie-based content, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe, hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you in the next one. I appreciate y'all. I love y'all if you made it to the end of the video. And if you did make it to the end of this video, then comment down below Russell Crowe, who is the original actor of the original Gladiator film. Anyway, guys, I'm out of this thing. I'll catch you on the next video. Peace.